So my talk today about the meaning of public services is about looking specifically at two different perspectives on what the meaning of a service is. So I'm going to start off looking at the perspective of service design, and this is probably best personified by this well-known slogan pioneered by Lou Downe, who's probably done as much as anyone, any specific individual, to kind of shape the way that people do user-centered design, certainly in government circles, but even more broadly than that. And that's this verb-based perspective, this slogan, good services are verbs, bad services are nouns, very catchy and very easy to understand what is meant by that, because as human-centered practitioners, we naturally want to focus on the tasks that users need to do. Users need to perform a task. A task involves doing something, which is an action of some sort. So therefore, the thinking goes that we need to frame everything around verbs. And that means that among some, a perception is formed that human-centered services should therefore avoid using nouns. Partly, that's what the slogan says, bad services are nouns. And it's interesting for me. I've been in this information architecture focused role for nearly 2 years now, having come from a more kind of generalist user experience background. So coming in to and thinking about the perspective of information architecture, which is a very different perspective, and looking at how it's a very noun-based perspective. Many information architects focus on the things that users need to do the tasks with. The thinking is that users think in terms of objects, they form a mental model of how objects relate to each other, and so we must model the nouns and the relationships between them. And information is organized by noun. And, this has been pioneered, there's lots of resources out there, lots of information architecture resources, domain-driven design, OUX from Sophia Prater, whose course I was doing when I was thinking about all this. So that got me thinking, what is actually a service? Is it the fact that bad services are nouns if it's so important it's organized by a noun? And do we need to be so verb focused? And so I looked at Lou Downe's original blog post where they were talking about this. And here's the example that was given of an improved name for a service. So they say, after several rounds of usability testing, the Home Office changed the name of immigration's health surcharge to check if you need to pay towards your healthcare in the UK. And when I was thinking about this, I noticed, well, it's not really a verb, is it? It's a full sentence. And yeah, there are verbs in there. Yeah, check, need, and pay are all in there. But there are nouns in there as well, health, care, and UK. And as for the example of that it was changed from, the name it was changed from, immigration health surcharge, the reason it's not very good is because it's jargon. It's not necessarily because it's a noun. So yeah, I didn't feel like we've been presented with evidence that nouns are bad and that they should be avoided. We've seen evidence that we should avoid jargon, but that's a different thing. So I started to think, well, that's an interesting structure there. That sentence contained both nouns and verbs. And so I looked at the homepages of gov.uk and mygov.scot this is such a strong pattern. In a way, it's kind of like a linguistic fact. This is the nature of a short sentence is that like this, it will contain verbs and nouns. But it really struck me how they almost actually attach together as a verb attached to a noun. Set up an account, sign into your account, get access to an e-visa, check your state pension forecast, etc., etc. This pattern seems to hold true across a very wide variety of services. So we go back to Lou Downe's definition of a service. I found this quite interesting too. Is in the book they wrote, Good Services. A service is something that helps someone to do something. So yes, it does help someone to do something. That's where the verb comes in. It helps them to do something, which is a noun, and also a service is something, which is a noun. And that I was looking at examples of some of these services that are available on gov.uk and mygov.scot and all these government services that we offer. And this is an example of, applying for probate. What is the user need here? The user no one wants to apply for probate. They just want probate. So, I feel like that, the thing that users need here, and certainly in this case, is the noun, is probate, is the thing itself. Whereas the verb, applying for probate, is almost like the administrative burden, is the hurdle that we put in the way of people getting it. And that's not to say that it shouldn't be there, because obviously there's good reasons why people have to apply. But it kind of got me thinking about, like, what is the relative importance of a verb in this world of public services, and how we name them. And as I said it near the start of this session, I was studying Sophia Prater's object-oriented UX course. At the time, I was thinking about all this, and she makes a brilliant point about the role of verbs, at least in her methodology around object-oriented UX. She describes them as the affordances of your objects. And the example she gives is that on Instagram, a post calls a user to like it, to comment on it, bookmark it, and share it. So it's not that verbs are unimportant, but I think I think we can work a lot harder to understand what are we actually saying when we're talking about verbs. Like, what's the point of focusing on a verb? I'm really grateful to Fergus Bissett, whose blog post I've linked to in the slide here, who saw what I wrote about this last year and wrote some really interesting responses that gave me a lot more food for thought. And it showed how verbs do a lot of heavy lifting in language. They very often imply more than meets the eye on the surface. So if we take the example of the verb book, as in to book an appointment, so even just having that word book, we already know that, well, yeah, we know that it's attached to an object, like an appointment. That's the noun in this world. But we also know that there's a user, someone needs to book the appointment. And it also might even imply that there's somewhere where this appointment is recorded and booked, like a booking system. Verbs can also imply a kind of a hierarchy of actions. So often, taking the example of apply for a blue badge, which was one of the other services that was listed on the homepages I was looking at, apply for a blue badge. You know, as human-centered practitioners, we'll often focus on this kind of level of the task, users applying for a blue badge. But of course, we know that a user is actually doing that in service of an overarching goal, something that they're trying to achieve in their lives. So that, you know, the user doesn't want to apply for the blue badge as such. They just want better mobility support, and that's what's you know, that's why they're accessing this service. But we can kind of go down the chain in the hierarchy as well. So we know that they probably need to fill in a form in order to apply for the blue badge. So they have subtasks. And even beneath that, there'll be individual operations like selecting a submit button. And we can imagine all this just from that word apply. You know, we kind of know that all these things exist from the use of that one verb in the first place. And there's some even more interesting examples that were supplied in another blog post that Fergus Bissett wrote about how verbs can imply multiple nouns and verbs. So by is a really interesting example of a powerful verb in that, you know, in what it kind of conjures up in our minds. So we know that there's a buyer, we know that there's an item that they're buying, and we know that there's a seller as well. So the buyer is buying from the seller sells the item, and the buyer's buying the item, and also there's an exchange of money, so it's even more complex than that. And all of that, you know, we're almost like we've got this little model in our heads of what it means to buy something. All this is kind of like a map of the reality of what buy is, and you know, it's doing such a lot of heavy lifting, this one word. Book as well is an interesting example. So we've already talked about book earlier in my slides, but here's another way you can map this out. So if a user wants to book an appointment because they've got some kind of underlying goal that they're trying to achieve that necessitates the appointment, we know that the appointment is probably provided by someone, and it will have a time slot. And there's probably even more things that we can imagine just from that one word book. Apply is another interesting one, where there will be an applicant who makes the application. They'll achieve some kind of benefit from a successful applications. You know, there's a reason that they're doing it, and again, that's attached to their kind of underlying real world goal. But the benefit will have certain criteria attached to it that we need to provide evidence to support it. And some kind of authority will evaluate the evidence. You know, the authority that's providing the benefit will evaluate the evidence. And you know, we know all these things must exist if the word apply exists. You know, that it kind of implies all of this entire map, which is really interesting around the power of a verb, but also how we need to be really clear about what the nouns actually are in this system to to really do this justice. That brings me to service patterns. So I've got colleagues in Scottish Government who work work in my department, and they're doing some brilliant work around identifying service patterns. I'd encourage you to read the blog post if you want to learn more about their work. They'll also be presenting at UX Scotland in Edinburgh in June, so it's a nice place to be if you want to come to Edinburgh and hear them talk about it. But they were doing this, we know there are lots of examples out there of governments and public sector organizations looking at and experimenting with service patterns and building them out right now. And it takes this verb focus. One of the interesting things that my colleagues have done, Kirsty and Anusri have done, is they're this is all about trying to articulate what technology components are needed to kind of make these patterns come to fruition, what makes them reality. Interesting work around service patterns, and they're doing that kind of in parallel with, at the same time as I was starting to think about content modeling and building out our information architecture work at the Scottish Government. And I think there's a lot of power in bringing these two kind of modes of thought together. And I think of it a bit like a flip clock. So there are 1,444 different possible times in a 24-hour period. But a flip clock manufacturer only has to make 24-hour flaps and 60-minute flaps to achieve all of those necessary combinations. And so I'm thinking about the way that service patterns and information architectures can come together in a similar way that verbs are by necessity attached to nouns. Because if we can identify the most important reusable objects in our system and the most important service patterns that we need to map out, we can achieve a lot of the necessary combinations to build out our public services and to improve people's access to them and run them more efficiently. So that's, in summary, public services, I think, are verbs and nouns. The verb focus is a really powerful framing. It helps us keep users' tasks in mind. So it's really important that, this idea in user-centered design that users are trying to do a thing. But yeah, users normally need a thing, the noun, that, it's the noun that people are often coming to our services for. They need some kind of change in their life, or, something to kind of come into their world. But verbs give us clues about what those things are, and we must make those things explicit to ensure that they're properly represented in the user experience. So we can codify our verbs through service patterns, we can codify our nouns and bring it all together through information models, and by doing both we have the potential to unlock great efficiencies, I think. So that's me. Thank you very much for listening, and happy to take any questions there might be.
Thanks, Duncan. That's really great. We've got one question which I want to read out, and then I've got some other thoughts as well. So the question is, do you think that the expectations of the future generations of government service users will change the verbs-noun relationships? For example, what do you mean I have to apply for something? Isn't it just automatic?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's a lot of the thinking that some of us are doing at the Scottish Government at the moment is like, that's a lot for me. A lot of the reason why we're doing some of this mapping is to identify, how can we automate more of this? So I'll give you an example. At the moment, we have a functionality called Smart Answer that we use in gov.scot, which basically sends users through a kind of a flow chart that helps people determine if they meet eligibility criteria. But we're exploring the possibility of, we've got a Scott account where people can be logged in. If we've got a logged in state and we've got certain information about users, how can we automate that? And I think there's a lot of potential there around, for me, it's a lot of the reason why we need to do this mapping now is to automate as much of that as possible and reduce the administrative burden so that maybe you don't have to apply for everything. Maybe we can inform you of services that you're not aware that you're eligible for. So yeah, I think there's a huge potential there in the near future.
Yeah, and I think that automation is interesting because, of course, one of the great drivers of automation is context, personalization. So by kind of understanding who you are in some sense, that means you can be directed to this thing rather than that thing. But also, I'm reminded of some of the things thinking we'll be doing about on Gov.uk with the idea where if we know you're from Scotland, we're not going to show you English stuff, we're going to show you Scottish stuff.
Absolutely.
And that's just one small example of actually narrowing down the user experience. And I have to give you a call out, Duncan, because you used that immortal information architecture phrase, reusable objects. Because as information architects, we live and die by reusable objects. We care a lot about reusable objects because it makes everything more efficient and everything more consistent. So we love reusable objects. Another question we've got in a few minutes left. Doing good thing from scratch, are there existing information models to use as a base or shortcut?
I'd love to know of them. One thing that we've been looking at a fair bit is the EU. This is in relation to the work that most of my work is centered around access to services, how people access public services. So we've been kind of peeking over the fence at some of the work that the EU do in their core vocabularies, and they've got almost like an ontology of what a service looks like. I think it misses a few things that we kind of need, like I don't need to bore you with details, but yeah, we try to borrow from where we can, because we're not. Obviously, the Scottish Government is not the only organisation facing this challenge, and I guess that's also it's a principle of kind of good information management. Is we don't need to reinvent the wheel. If someone else has got a good interoperable model, we should make use of it. So I'd love to know if anyone is aware of something that we can take inspiration from.
Yeah, well, what's that cliche joke? The great thing about standards is there are just so many of them.
Yes, yeah. I'm thinking of a particular XKCD comic.
Yeah, there are certainly useful standards which you can kind of bootstrap your activity. Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple more minutes. Does anybody want to kind of use an actual voice to ask a question, or shall we kind of have a little time back? You all shy? No questions? Let's give another moment. Cool. Okay, I think we're 3 minutes in hand then. And thank you very much, Duncan. Really fantastic.